Let's take a look at a definition of conflict. There's been no shortage of definitions for the word conflict, but common to most is the idea that conflict is a perception. If no one is aware of a conflict, then it's generally agreed no conflict exists. Conflict is a process that begins when one party perceives that another party has negatively affected them. Conflict describes the point in ongoing activity when interaction becomes disagreement. People experience a wide range of conflicts in organizations over the incompatibility of goals or disagreements over expectations. There's no consensus over the role in conflict of groups and organizations. In the past, researchers tended to argue about whether conflict was uniformly good or bad. Such simplistic views eventually gave way to approaches recognizing that not all conflicts are the same and that different types of conflict have different effects. Contemporary perspectives differentiate types of conflict based on their effects. Functional conflict supports the goals of the group, improves its performance, and is thus a constructive form of conflict. Conflict that hinders group performance is destructive or dysfunctional. A highly personal struggle for control in a team that distracts from the task at hand is dysfunctional. One way of understanding conflict is to identify the type of disagreement or what the conflict is about. Although each conflict is unique, researchers have classified conflicts into three categories: task, relationship, or process. Task conflict relates to the content and goals of the work. Relationship conflict focuses on interpersonal relationships. Process conflict is about how the work gets done. Studies demonstrate that relationship conflicts in work settings are almost always dysfunctional. The friction and interpersonal hostilities inherent in relationship conflicts increase personality clashes and decrease mutual understanding, which hinders the completion of organizational tasks. One study demonstrated that teams of individuals who are on average high in openness and emotional stability are better able to turn task conflict into increased group performance. Researchers found that process conflicts are about delegation and roles. Conflicts over delegation often revolve around the perception of some members as shrinking, and conflicts over roles can leave some group members as feeling marginalized. We've all been part of groups in which arguments about roles and responsibilities seem to go nowhere. Another way to understand conflict is to understand its locus, or the framework within which it occurs. Here too, there are three basic types. Dyadic conflict is conflict between two people. Intragroup conflict occurs within a group of people. Intergroup conflict is conflict between groups or teams. Nearly all the literature on task, relationship, and process conflict considers intragroup conflict within the group. However, it doesn't necessarily tell us all that we need to know about the context and outcomes of conflict. For example, research has found that for intragroup task conflict to influence performance within the team positively, it's important that the team has a supportive climate in which mistakes aren't penalized. In one study, group members were relatively peripheral in their own group were better at resolving conflicts between their group and another one. Understanding functional and dysfunctional conflict requires not only that we identify the type of conflict, we also need to know where it occurs. It's possible that the concepts of task, relationship, and process conflict are useful in understanding intragroup or even dyadic conflict. They're less useful in explaining the effects of intergroup conflict. A better understanding of the conflict process will provide insight about collaborative and controllable variables. The conflict process has 5 stages: potential opposition, cognition, intentions, behavior, and outcomes. The first stage of conflict is the appearance of conditions, causes, or sources that create opportunities for it to arise. We group the conditions into 3 general categories: communication, structure, and personal variables. Just because a disagreement is perceived conflict doesn't mean that it's personalized. It's felt at the conflict level, when individuals become emotionally involved, that they experience anxiety, tension, frustration, or hostility. Intentions are a distinct stage because we have to infer that others intend to know how to respond to behavior. Many conflicts escalate simply because one party attributes the wrong intentions to the other. When one person seeks to satisfy his or her own interest regardless of the impact on the other, the person is competing. We are more apt to compete when resources are scarce. If you attempt to find a win-win solution that allows both parties' goals to be completely achieved, that's collaborating. A person may recognize that a conflict exists and wants to withdraw or suppress it. Examples of avoiding include trying to ignore a conflict and keeping away from others with whom you disagree. A party who seeks to appease an opponent may be willing to place the opponent's interests above their own, sacrificing to maintain the relationship. We refer to this intention as accommodating. In compromising, there's a willingness to accept a solution with incomplete satisfaction of both parties' concerns. The behavior stage is where most conflict becomes visible. Statements, actions, and reactions made by conflicting parties, usually as overt attempts to implement their own intentions. These outcomes may be functional if the conflict improves the group's performance. Negotiation is a process that occurs when two or more parties decide how to allocate scarce resources. Although we commonly think of the outcomes of negotiation in one-shot economic terms, every negotiation in an organization also affects the relationship between negotiators and the way negotiators feel about themselves. Depending on how much the parties are going to interact with one another, sometimes maintaining the social relationship and behaving ethically will be just as important as achieving an immediate outcome of bargaining. Note that we use the terms negotiation and bargaining interchangeably. There are two general approaches to negotiation: distributive bargaining and integrative bargaining. They differ in their goal and motivation, focus, interest, information sharing, and duration of relationship. Let's define each and illustrate some differences. Distributive bargaining is negotiating over who gets what share of a set amount of goods or services. Its identifying feature is that it operates under a zero-sum condition. That is, any gain I make is at your expense and vice versa. In negotiation, each party has a target point that they'd like to achieve and a resistance point at the lowest acceptable outcome. As long as there's some overlap, there is a settlement range in which each one's aspirations can be met. When you're engaged in distributive bargaining, one of the best things you can do is make the first offer and make it an aggressive one. Making the first offer shows power, and people tend to fixate on initial information. Say that you have a job offer and your prospective employer asks your preferred starting salary. You have a chance to set the anchor, meaning you should ask for the highest salary you think the employer could reasonably offer. What happens much more often is that we ask for less than we should have achieved. In contrast to distributive bargaining, integrative bargaining assumes one or more of the possible settlements can create a win-win solution. In organizations, integrative bargaining is preferable to distributive bargaining because it builds long-term relationships. Integrative bargaining allows negotiators to leave the bargaining table feeling like they achieved a victory. Compromise may be your worst enemy in negotiating a win-win agreement. People settle for less than they could have attained if they were forced to consider the other party's interests. There are 5 steps in the negotiation process. It views negotiations as made up of 5 steps: preparation and planning, definition of ground rules, clarification and justification, bargaining and problem solving, and closure and implementation. Before you get started negotiating, understanding who is involved, their perceptions of the conflict, and your goals is important. It helps you to put your goals in writing and develop a range of outcomes to keep your attention focused. Then, define with the other party the ground rules of the negotiation itself. Who will be doing the negotiating? Where will it take place? And to what issues will negotiation be limited? When you've exchanged initial positions, you and the other party will explain, amplify, clarify, bolster, and justify your original demands. Provide the other party with any documentation that supports your position. The essence of the negotiation process is the actual give and take in trying to hash out an agreement. This is where both parties need to make concessions. The final step in the negotiation process is formalizing your agreement and developing procedures necessary for implementing and monitoring it. For other cases, closure of the negotiation process is nothing more than forming a handshake. Four factors influence how well individuals negotiate: personality, emotions, culture, and gender. We might think agreeable individuals are easy prey in negotiation, especially distributive ones. The evidence suggests that personality and negotiation outcomes are related, but only weakly. Evoking emotions, such as sympathy or expressing other emotions like anger or sadness, may be used to persuade others. You should show anger in negotiation only if you have at least as much power as your counterpart. People from different cultures negotiate differently. However, there are many nuances in the way this works. It isn't as simple as these negotiations are the best. Indeed, success in negotiations depends on the context. It appears that people generally negotiate more effectively within cultures than between them. In cross-cultural negotiation, it's especially important that the negotiators be high in openness. There are many areas of organizational behavior in which men and women are not that different. Negotiation is not one of them. It seems that men and women negotiate differently, and these differences affect outcomes. Some negotiations occur among parties that meet only once and in isolation from other individuals. In organizations, however, many negotiations are open-ended and public. When you're trying to figure out who in a work group should do a tedious task, negotiating with your boss to get a chance to travel internationally, or asking for more money for a project, there's a social component to the negotiation. You're probably negotiating with someone you already know and will work with again, and the negotiation and its outcome are likely to be topics people will talk about. To understand negotiations, then, we need to consider the social factors of reputation and relationships. Your reputation is the way other people think and talk about you. When it comes to negotiation, having a reputation for being trustworthy matters. Trust in negotiation processes opens up the door to many forms of integrative negotiation strategies that benefit both parties. The most effective way to build trust is to behave in an honest way across repeated interactions. Then, others will feel more comfortable making open-ended efforts with many different outcomes. Sometimes we either trust or distrust people based on word of mouth about a person's characteristics. A combination of competence and integrity often help a person develop a trustworthy reputation. Negotiators, higher in self-confidence and cognitive ability, are seen as more competent by negotiation partners. Individuals who have a reputation for integrity can also be more effective in negotiation. Finally, individuals who have more solid reputations are better liked and have more friends and allies. There's more to repeated negotiations than just reputation. The interpersonal component of relationships with repeated negotiations means that individuals go beyond valuing what's simply good for themselves and instead to start to think about what's best for the other party and the relationship as a whole. Repeated negotiations built on a foundation of trust also broaden the range of options because a favor or concession today can be offered in return for some repayment further down the road. Repeated negotiations also facilitate integrative problem solving. This occurs partly because a sense of trust and reliability has been built. Negotiations and negotiators who are consistently demonstrating honesty and integrity usually have better outcomes. Occasionally, individuals or group representatives reach a stalemate and are unable to resolve their differences through direct negotiations. In such cases, they may turn to a third party to help them find a solution. There are three basic third-party roles: mediator, arbitrator, and conciliator. A mediator is a neutral third party who facilitates a negotiated solution by using reasoning and persuasion, suggesting alternatives. Mediators are widely used in labor management negotiations and are fairly effective. An arbitrator is a third party with the authority to dictate an agreement. Arbitration can be voluntary, requested by the parties, or compulsory, forced on the parties by law or contract. The big plus of arbitration over mediation is that it always results in a settlement. If one party is left feeling overwhelmingly defeated, that party is certain to be dissatisfied and the conflict may resurface at a later time. A conciliator is a trusted third party who provides an informal communication link between the negotiator and the opponent. Comparing conciliation to mediation has proven difficult because the two overlap a great deal. In practice, conciliators also engage in fact finding, interpret messages, and help develop agreements.